John and his wife Maria lived in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and tidy lawns. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other while walking dogs, and where most houses looked similar, with neatly painted fences and mailboxes decorated with flowers. At first glance, it seemed like a calm and peaceful community, but like many suburban neighborhoods, it had its share of gossip and drama. Much of that came from the HOA, which meant the Homeowners Association, and especially from one woman in particular, Karen. Everyone knew her. She was the kind of person who watched her neighbors too closely, noticed every small thing, and complained whenever something didn't match her idea of perfection. John and Maria had lived there for a couple of years and were used to Karen's stares. She had already complained about their lawn being a little too long once, and another time she left a note about their trash cans being at the curb for too many hours. John found it annoying, but Maria usually brushed it off. Maria wasn't the type to get bothered by neighborhood drama. She had bigger responsibilities, one she hadn't told everyone in the neighborhood about yet. For the past several years, Maria had worked her way up through the police department. She was known for being calm under pressure, strict but fair, and very professional. Recently, she had achieved something she was proud of. She had been promoted to chief of police. It was the highest position in the department, something she had worked hard for. She didn't brag about it, though. At home, she wanted to live a simple life. She didn't wear her title on her sleeve, and only a few neighbors knew what she did for work. Maria liked it that way because she wanted to be judged as a neighbor, not as an officer. One sunny afternoon, John sat on the porch sipping iced tea while Maria pulled her car into the driveway. She had just finished a long day at the station, and she was still in her uniform. The polished badge on her chest gleamed in the sunlight, and her duty belt was strapped around her waist. Holding the standard equipment radio, handcuffs, and her service weapons secured in its holster. It was nothing unusual for her. She was used to finishing her shift and walking into the house like that. She planned to change into comfortable clothes once she got inside. John waved at her as she got out of the car. She smiled back, tired but happy to be home. She locked the car and walked up the path toward the front door. To John, it was an ordinary moment, just part of their daily routine. But to someone else, it was something entirely different. Across the street, behind a set of lace curtains, Karen was watching. She had been standing at her window, as she often did, peeking out to see what her neighbors were up to. When she saw Maria step out of her car in full uniform, Karen's eyes widened. Her attention locked onto the holstered gun at Maria's side. Instead of recognizing it as a police officer's duty weapon, Karen's mind jumped straight to the worst possible conclusion. She muttered to herself, "Oh my God, she's carrying a gun." In broad daylight? This is a residential neighborhood. Her pulse quickened as she leaned closer to the glass, convinced she was witnessing something dangerous. She didn't notice the badge. She didn't see the uniform for what it was. All she saw was what she wanted to see: someone dangerous walking around with a firearm. Karen had a history of overreacting to things. She was the kind of person who always expected the worst. Maria, meanwhile, didn't give it a second thought. She smiled at John, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. To her, the day was over, and she was ready to take off the heavy uniform and relax. She placed her bag by the door and went upstairs to change. John stayed on the porch, enjoying the breeze. Karen, though, had already started pacing in her living room. She grabbed her phone and held it tightly, debating what to do. Her mind ran wild with exaggerated scenarios. She thought, what if that woman is some criminal pretending to live here? What if she plans to harm someone? What if kids are outside and see her with a gun? By the time she made up her mind, she had convinced herself she was doing something heroic. She dialed 911. When the operator answered, Karen's voice was already high-pitched and frantic. She didn't calmly explain what she had seen. Instead, she exaggerated. "There's a woman in my neighborhood walking around with a gun," she cried. "She was waving it around. She looks dangerous. I think she might be threatening people." Description was far from the truth, but the operator on the other end took it seriously. Any call about an armed person in a neighborhood had to be treated as an emergency. The dispatcher asked for details, and Karen continued to describe Maria with words that made her sound like a criminal. She's wearing dark clothes. Looks tough. She just got out of a car and walked toward a house. She's carrying a weapon. Please send someone fast." Karen hung up after giving the address and felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She believed she had just saved the neighborhood. She didn't even stop to consider asking Maria directly or thinking about whether she might be wrong. In Karen's mind, she was always right. Back on the porch, John noticed nothing unusual. He didn't see Karen watching. He didn't know about the call. He simply leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea, listening to the distant sound of children. Playing a few houses down, it was peaceful. Inside, Maria changed out of her uniform, humming quietly as she prepared to start dinner. She had no idea what storm was already on its way. Across town, several officers received the alert. The dispatcher's voice over the radio was clear. "Report of an armed woman in a residential neighborhood. Possible threat. Approach with caution." Officers immediately turned their cars toward John and Maria's street, sirens off but lights. Ready? In just a few minutes, the quiet evening in that neighborhood would change completely. The phone call was over, and Karen sat in her living room feeling proud of herself. She had no doubt that she had done the right thing. In her mind, she had just saved the whole neighborhood from danger. She imagined police cars rushing in, thanking her for being a good citizen. She just smiled to herself, pacing back and forth, glancing out her window every few seconds to make sure nothing else was happening across the street. From her perspective, it was only a matter of time before the police arrived and removed the threat. Inside the house, Maria had already taken off her uniform jacket and set her badge and belt neatly on the dresser. She was changing into her comfortable clothes, a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, while humming a little tune. She felt relief in finally being home after a long, demanding day. She didn't even think about the fact that she had walked in wearing her sidearm. It was routine, something she had done countless times before. To her, nothing unusual had happened. She went downstairs and started preparing dinner, cutting vegetables in the kitchen, unaware of the storm heading her way. John was still on the porch, rocking slightly in his chair, enjoying the cool air. He liked evenings like this. The street was calm. The sky was turning a soft orange as the sun lowered, and kids from the neighborhood were riding bikes at the far end of the street. He had no reason to think anything would disturb the peace. Meanwhile, in the police station across town, radios crackled with urgency. "We have a call of an armed female in a residential neighborhood. Possible threat? Address incoming." Officers who were on patrol immediately perked up. Calls involving weapons were always treated with the highest seriousness. Within minutes, several squad cars were already turning onto the main road leading to John and Maria's neighborhood. Sirens were not blaring yet. The officers wanted to arrive quietly, so they only used flashing lights as they approached. Back in the house, Maria placed a pot of water on the stove. John called in from the porch asking what was for dinner, and Maria laughed, shouting back, "Pasta, if you're lucky." The light-hearted mood made it even harder to imagine what was about to happen. Karen, still glued to her window, gasped when she saw the faint blue and red lights approaching at the end of the street. Her heart raced with excitement. She felt important, like the hero of the moment. She whispered to herself, "Finally, they're here. Now, they'll see I was right." She adjusted her position at the window, making sure she could see everything, eager to watch what she thought would be a dramatic arrest. The first squad car stopped near the entrance of the neighborhood, followed quickly by two more. Their lights flashed silently, creating a surreal glow against the quiet houses. The officers stepped out cautiously, scanning the street. They didn't draw their weapons yet, but their hands hovered near their holsters. They had no idea what to expect. For them, the call was clear. A woman with a gun was threatening the peace of a residential area. John noticed the lights first. He sat up straight, frowning. It wasn't common to see 3 police cars arriving together in their neighborhood. He stood and leaned over the porch rail to get a better look. His first thought was that maybe there had been an accident or some trouble down the street. He didn't realize, not yet, that the officers were coming straight toward his house. Hearing the faint sounds outside, walked to the window with a puzzled look. "Why are there so many police cars?" she asked, mostly to herself. John shrugged, confused. But before he could answer, The officers began moving up the street with urgency. Their eyes were fixed on John's house. One of the officers shouted, "Loudly, ma'am, sir. Step outside slowly." The sudden command startled John so much that he nearly dropped his glass of tea. He stepped back, blinking in surprise. Maria froze for a second before her training kicked in. She could hear the authority in their voices. She knew they believed there was danger, though she didn't yet understand why. John called back, "What's going on? We live here?" But the officers didn't relax. Their hands hovered near their weapons, their posture tense. From behind the safety of her curtains, Karen's face lit up. She whispered, "Yes, that's her house. That's where she went. They're going to get her now." She watched with a sense of victory, absolutely sure she had been right all along. Maria took a deep breath and whispered to John, "Stay calm. Don't argue with them." She stepped forward, her instincts as both a police officer and now a chief guiding her. She opened the door and slowly walked onto the porch, her hands visible. She had already changed into her casual clothes, so she looked nothing like the uniformed officer she had been minutes earlier. The sight of her made the officers even more cautious. To them, she was just a civilian walking out of the house. Officer barked again, "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them. Identify yourself." John's heart pounded. He didn't understand why they were treating his wife like a suspect. "She lives here," he shouted, his voice breaking with frustration. "She's my wife." Maria, however, remained calm. She held her hands slightly raised and said clearly, "My name is Maria. I live here. Please check my ID. I am not a threat." The tension in the air was thick. Every neighbor on the street had now peeked out of their windows, some stepping onto their lawns to watch. Whispers ran through the crowd. No one knew what was happening, but the flashing lights and raised voices made it feel serious. Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. She burst out her front door, pointing dramatically across the street. "That's her," she screamed. "That's the woman with the gun. She had it right there on her hip earlier. I saw it. She's dangerous. Arrest her before she hurts someone." The officers turned their eyes back to Maria, their expressions torn between duty and doubt. Something didn't quite fit. The woman in front of them looked calm, not dangerous. She wasn't holding a weapon. She wasn't making threats. Still, the report they had received had been serious. They couldn't just ignore it. Maria spoke firmly, her voice steady. "Officer, I need you to radio my name in. My full name is Maria Lopez. Badge number 117. Check it now." The officers hesitated, then one quickly lifted his radio and repeated her information to the dispatcher. The others kept their eyes on Maria, waiting for confirmation. For a few long seconds, the neighborhood was filled with nothing but the crackle of the police radio and the heavy breathing of people caught in the middle of the confusion. John clenched his fists, furious but afraid to make things worse. Maria's calm presence was the only thing preventing the situation from spiraling out of control. She knew that any sudden move or wrong word could escalate things in a dangerous way. Behind her, the pot of water boiled loudly on the stove, forgotten. The normal routine of dinner was completely overshadowed by flashing lights, raised voices, and Karen's triumphant cries. Then finally, the voice of the dispatcher came back over the radio. Confirmed Maria Lopez, Chief of Police. Chief of Police. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. The officers blinked at her, their tense expressions melting into shock. Their weapons lowered slightly as the reality sank in. The woman they had been called to confront was not just another neighbor. She was their new chief, and Karen, standing in the middle of the street with her finger still pointed, had no idea yet that everything was about to turn against her. The moment the dispatcher's words echoed through the radio, the entire mood shifted. Just seconds earlier, the officers had been tense, hands ready on their weapons, their voices sharp with command. Now, they stood frozen in disbelief, staring at the calm woman in front of them, Chief of Police. That's what the voice had said. They looked at each other, their eyes wide, as if trying to silently confirm what they had just heard. The woman they were treating like a suspect wasn't only a fellow officer, but their new leader. Maria kept her hands steady, her expression calm. Inside, her heart beat a little faster, but she refused to let it show. She had been in tense situations before she knew that the worst thing she could do now was let her emotions take control. Slowly, she lowered her arms. But her eyes stayed locked on the ranking officer in front of her. John, on the other hand, couldn't hold his anger back any longer. "Do you see now?" he shouted. His voice cracked with a mix of fear and rage. "That's my wife. She's not a criminal. She's your boss." His chest heaved as he took a step forward, but Maria quickly raised her hand, signaling him to stay calm. She didn't want him to make things worse. Karen, however, didn't seem to understand what had just happened. She still stood on her lawn, pointing her finger with wild eyes. "Don't believe her," she yelled. "She's lying. I saw her with the gun. She was showing it off, scaring people. You can't just let her go. Arrest her." Her voice cracked with desperation, but her words only sounded more ridiculous to the crowd of neighbors who had gathered. Whispers spread among them. Some shook their heads, embarrassed by her behavior. Others simply stared, stunned by the turn of events. The ranking officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Chief Lopez, I apologize. All we received a call of an armed suspect. The description led us here. I had no idea." His words trailed off. He lowered his eyes, ashamed. Maria exhaled slowly. "I understand you had to respond," she said evenly. "But now you see the problem. Someone in this neighborhood made a false report." She tilted her head slightly toward Karen, who was still babbling angrily. The officer nodded and ordered his men to stand down. The younger officers, clearly shaken, holstered their weapons and stepped back, their faces red with embarrassment. They looked like children caught misbehaving in front of a strict teacher. John crossed his arms, glaring at Karen. "This is what you've been doing all along, isn't it? Meddling, spying, running to the HOA about every little thing? But this time you crossed the line. You didn't just complain about lawns or trash cans. You could have gotten someone killed tonight." His voice rose with every word, sharp and furious. Karen stomped her foot, her cheeks flushed red. "I did the right thing. She had a gun. Guns don't belong in neighborhoods like this. I don't care who she says she is. I saw what I saw." Maria turned toward her, her expression calm, but her tone firm. "What you saw," she said, "was an officer in uniform, carrying her service weapon in its holster. That is required by law. I had just returned home from work. At no point did I threaten anyone, and at no point was anyone in danger. You made assumptions. Dangerous assumptions." Her words carried weight, and even from a distance the neighbors could feel it. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but the sharpness in Maria's eyes silenced her for a moment. The ranking officer took a step forward, addressing Maria respectfully. "Chief, would you like us to take her statement?" "This is technically a false report." His tone was cautious, aware that the situation was delicate. Karen gasped, realizing for the first time that she might be in trouble. "False report? No. No, I was protecting everyone. I didn't lie. I was just doing my duty as part of the HOA." She laughed nervously, looking around for support from the neighbors, but none of them defended her. In fact, several crossed their arms and shook their heads, clearly tired of her antics. John smirked bitterly. "Duty as part of the HOA? That's rich. You've been harassing us for months. It's about the lawn, about the trash bins, about the fence color. And now you've gone and called armed officers to our door for no reason at all. Do you have any idea what could have happened if they had fired their weapons?" Karen flinched at his words, but stubbornly crossed her arms. "I wasn't wrong," she muttered under her breath. Though her voice had lost most of its strength, Maria stepped down from the porch, her presence commanding. She didn't raise her voice, but the quiet authority in her tone made everyone listen. "Do you understand what you did, Karen? You told the police I was waving a gun around? That's not what happened. You lied whether you realize it or not. And because of that lie, officers came here ready to fire if necessary. That means my husband's life, my neighbors' lives, and even my own life were at risk because of your words." Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. For the first time, she looked unsure of herself. Her eyes darted toward the officers, hoping one of them would back her up, but they remained silent. their eyes downcast. The silence was broken by a small voice from the crowd of neighbors. "She's right," someone said softly. "This could have gone really bad," another neighbor added. "Karen, you always cause trouble. It's time you went too far." Murmurs of agreement spread. Karen's face grew redder with every word. John folded his arms across his chest, standing tall beside Maria. He didn't need to say anything more. The neighborhood itself had turned against Karen now. Maria took a deep breath, her professional side guiding her actions. "Officers, I appreciate your quick response. You did your job with the information you had, but now we all know where that false information came from." She glanced at Karen again, her voice calm but cutting. "This is not how neighbors should treat each other, and this is certainly not how the law should be used." Karen tried one last desperate plea, but I thought you thought wrong," Maria interrupted, her voice sharp now. "And your thoughtless actions could have ended with someone's death." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Everyone could feel it. The flashing lights reflected off the houses, casting long shadows, and for a moment, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The officers shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Maria's next words. Karen's lips trembled, her earlier confidence completely gone. She no longer looked like the proud HOA watchdog. She looked small, almost fragile, shrinking under the weight of her own mistake. And though Maria had handled many dangerous criminals in her career, there was something uniquely frustrating about this moment. Here she was, in her own neighborhood, her safe place, being treated like a threat because of one woman's prejudice and arrogance. She steadied herself. She would not let anger control her. She would let the truth speak for itself. The confrontation wasn't over, but the power had shifted completely. The officers knew the truth. The neighbors knew the truth. Stakar, for the first time, realized that she wasn't the hero of the story she thought she was. The flashing lights from the police cars painted the quiet street in blue and red as the tension hung heavy in the air. Maria stood tall at the edge of her porch, calm but unshakable, while Karen still trembled on her lawn, her face red with anger and embarrassment. The officers had stepped back, unsure of what to do next. They had already lowered their weapons after realizing who Maria was, but the shame of the mistake weighed on them. None of them wanted to make eye contact with their new chief. The ranking officer, still standing in front, shifted uncomfortably. "Chief Lopez," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Again, I want to apologize for how this situation unfolded. We responded to the call with the information we were given. We had no idea." He trailed off because he knew there was no excuse good enough. Maria nodded slightly, her tone professional but firm. "I understand. You acted on the report you received. But now we must deal with the bigger issue. Why that report was made in the first place." She turned her eyes toward Karen, who flinched under the sharpness of her gaze. Karen raised her chin, still trying to hold on to her pride. "I was protecting the neighborhood. It's my duty as part of the HOA. If I see something suspicious, I report it. That's what I did. You can't punish me for that." John stepped forward, his voice hot with anger. "Suspicious? She's my wife, Karen. She walked out of her car in her work uniform. She wasn't threatening anyone. You didn't see anything. Dangerous, you made it up in your head because you wanted to find something wrong with us, just like you always do. You've been spying on us for months, picking at every little thing. This time you didn't just complain about trash cans or lawns. You brought the police to our door with guns drawn. That's not protecting the neighborhood. That's harassment." Several neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalks nodded in agreement. One older man muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "She's always stirring up trouble." A woman added, "She nearly got them shot tonight." The quiet murmurs spread, and Karen's eyes darted nervously from one neighbor to another. For once, she wasn't getting nods of support or silent agreement. She was being judged, and it stung. The ranking officer looked at Maria again. "Chief, technically this is a false report. We could process it formally. Did you want to pursue charges?" Karen's eyes widened in panic. "Charges? Can't do that? I wasn't lying. I saw her with a gun." Maria crossed her arms, her calm voice cutting through Karen's panic. "Hush, yes. You saw a gun. But you reported that I was waving it around threatening people. That never happened. You created a story in your head and then you told the police it was real. That is a false report. And false reports waste resources, endanger lives, and put everyone here at risk, Karen sputtered, searching for words. I didn't mean... Maria stepped closer, her presence commanding. Intentions don't erase consequences. What you did tonight could have ended in tragedy. Officers showed up ready to act on the words you gave them. My husband could have been mistaken for a threat. A neighbor could have been hurt. I could have been shot by my own team because of your carelessness. Do you understand the seriousness of that? Karen looked down at the ground, her face pale. Now, for once, she had no comeback. No smug remarks. John's voice rose again, filled with anger. You've been hiding behind the HOA for too long, acting like the neighborhood sheriff. But look at what happened when you tried to play hero for real. You endangered us all. You nearly turned our street into a crime scene. The neighbors murmured louder now, emboldened. Someone called out, "She's been nothing but trouble." Another added, "We're tired of her constant complaints." The crowd's frustration with Karen was spilling out, their patience finally breaking. Karen shook her head, panicked by the voices turning against her. No, you don't understand. I was only trying to do the right thing. I care about this community. But her words sounded hollow now, even to her own ears. Maria took another steady breath and looked at the officers. This is a teachable moment, she said clearly. Yes, this was a false report, but I will not press charges. Tonight, instead, I expect a formal warning to be issued. And I want it noted that if she ever abuses emergency services like this again, it will not end with just a warning. Karen's mouth dropped open. Relief and humiliation fought across her face. She wasn't going to jail, but the sting of being officially warned in front of the whole neighborhood was almost worse to her pride. The ranking officer nodded quickly. Understood, Chief. He turned to Karen. Ma'am, you need to understand that what you did tonight was dangerous. Filing a false report is a crime. If you ever do this again, there will be consequences far more serious than this. Karen's shoulders slumped. Her voice was small now, stripped of its usual superiority. I understand. The neighbors didn't look convinced. Many of them were shaking their heads, whispering about how she had finally been caught in her own web. For years, she had been the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, reporting every small infraction to the HOA, making people miserable with her constant nagging. But now, she had gone too far, and everyone had seen it. John put his arm around Maria, finally able to relax a little, though his anger still burned beneath the surface. You got off easy, Karen, he said coldly. If it were up to me, you'd be sitting in the back of one of those squad cars right now. Karen swallowed, hard, unable to meet his eyes. She turned toward her house, but the walk back across her lawn felt longer than ever. Every step was heavy with shame as the neighbors watched her retreat. For once, she had no audience clapping for her, no sense of victory. Only silence and disapproval followed her. The officers began to step back, toward their cars, their faces still tense with embarrassment. One young officer glanced at Maria, clearly uncomfortable, and said quietly, Chief, I'm sorry. Maria gave him a nod, not unkind, but firm. Next time, verify. Don't just rely on panic. Always look for the truth. The young officer nodded quickly, taking her words to heart, as the cars pulled away. The neighborhood slowly returned to quiet. The flashing lights faded, the sirens stayed silent, and the normal sounds of crickets and evening air returned. But the street did not feel the same. The neighbors had witnessed something they wouldn't forget: Karen's downfall, Maria's strength, and just how quickly one false call could put lives at risk. John looked at Maria, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe this is what it's come to. No. Because Karen can't mind her own business. Maria gave him a small, tired smile. Some people need control so badly, they'll invent problems just to feel important. She squeezed his hand and led him back inside, where the pot on the stove had boiled over, spilling water onto the burner. John chuckled despite himself. Guess dinner will be a little late tonight. Maria laughed softly, the sound easing the heavy tension of the evening. "That's fine," she said. "At least we're safe." Outside, the neighbors slowly drifted back into their homes, shaking their heads and murmuring to each other. Karen's name would be on every tongue for weeks. Her reputation as the nosy, meddling HOA watchdog had just transformed into something worse. The neighbor who called the cops on the chief of police and ended up humiliated in front of everyone. And though Maria chose not to press charges that night, everyone knew the warning was clear. Karen's power over the neighborhood was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The police cars were gone, the flashing lights fading into the distance, but the weight of the evening still lingered in the air. Maria and John stood together on their porch for a moment, watching as the neighbors quietly slipped back into their houses. The street that had been filled with whispers, flashing lights, and shouts just minutes before was suddenly calm again. It almost felt unreal, like the chaos had been a dream. But the sting of what happened was too fresh to forget. Maria let out a long breath and finally guided John inside. The pot on the stove had boiled dry, leaving a faint burnt smell in the kitchen. She turned off the burner with a sigh, shaking her head at the small mess. John chuckled bitterly. "All that. And now we don't even get dinner." His laugh wasn't full of joy. It was the kind of laugh people give when they're still full of tension. But too tired to stay angry, Maria gave him a small smile. "Well, order pizza. After tonight, I think we deserve it." She sat down at the table, resting her head in her hands for a moment. John joined her, still shaken. "I can't believe that just happened," he said. "Karen actually called the cops on you, of all people on you, and they showed up ready to draw their guns. If you weren't who you are," his voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. He didn't want to imagine how badly things could have ended. Maria nodded slowly. "That's exactly the point. If this had happened to anyone else, it could have been much worse. False reports put lives in danger. One wrong move, one miscommunication, and a life can be lost. Tonight we were lucky." John leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "She won't learn. Karen never learns. She'll spin this into some story where she's the victim. Just wait. She'll say she was just trying to protect the neighborhood." Maria reached for his hand. "Maybe, but after tonight, no one's going to see her the same way." The whole street was watching. They saw the truth with their own eyes. They saw who she really is. Outside, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly, even though the people were back in their homes. Text messages were flying. Whispers were spreading. Word of what happened would move fast. It was the kind of story neighbors repeated over and over, each time adding little details. By tomorrow morning, everyone in the HOA would know. Across the street, Karen sat in her own living room in near darkness. The glow of the streetlight outside cast a pale light over her face. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and her jaw was clenched. She replayed the scene in her mind again and again. She had thought she would be praised for calling the police, that people would thank her for being alert. Instead, she had been humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. The officers she thought would arrest Maria had turned against her. The neighbors she thought she was protecting had muttered against her. And worst of all, Maria, the woman she had tried to expose, had turned out to be the new chief of police. Karen's pride hurt more than anything. She didn't want to admit she was wrong, but deep down, the truth gnawed at her. She had misjudged the situation, which had led her dislike for Maria cloud her judgment. She had made herself look like a fool, and everyone had seen it. Meanwhile, back at John and Maria's house, the doorbell rang. John frowned, standing up cautiously. He peeked through the window and saw two neighbors standing there, a husband and wife who lived a few houses down. John opened the door, and they both smiled nervously. "Hey," the man said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We just wanted to say, we're sorry about what happened tonight. That was crazy. We know you didn't do anything wrong." His wife nodded. "Karen has been a problem for years. She'd finally crossed the line. We just wanted you to know we don't believe her nonsense." Maria joined John at the door, offering a tired smile. "Thank you, I appreciate that." The neighbors chatted for a few more minutes, and when they left, Maria felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about finally breaking the hold Karen had on the neighborhood. People had seen her for what she really was. As the night went on, more messages came in. A couple of neighbors texted John expressing support. One even joked, "I guess Karen forgot who she was messing with." John laughed at that one, finally able to let go of some of his frustration. Later, as they sat on the couch with a box of pizza between them, John shook his head again. "You know, the funniest part of all this is the irony. She tried to call the cops on you and she didn't even realize you're literally the new chief. She called your own officers on you." He laughed harder this time, and Maria couldn't help but laugh too. "It is ironic," she admitted. "She thought she was exposing me. Instead, she exposed herself." The laughter helped lighten the heavy weight that had been pressing down all evening. For the first time since the chaos began, the house felt normal again. The next morning, the sun rose over the neighborhood like any other day, but things were different now. Karen walked out to get her mail, and instead of the polite wave she usually received, though often forced, she was met with cold stares and whispers. Neighbors avoided her eyes. Some shook their heads. The humiliation from the night before hadn't faded. It had only grown. Maria, on the other hand, received quiet nods of respect. One neighbor smiled warmly and said, "Good morning, Chief." Maria smiled back, not rubbing it in, but feeling grateful that the truth was clear. Karen's reputation, which had already been shaky, was now ruined. People no longer saw her as a concerned neighbor. They saw her as the woman who wasted. Police resources endangered her neighbors and embarrassed herself in front of everyone. Inside her home, Karen fumed, replaying the night over and over. She told herself she was misunderstood, that people were being unfair. But deep down, she knew she had gone too far. And the worst part was knowing that every time people looked at her now, they would remember the night she called the cops on the chief of police. For Maria and John, life slowly returned to normal. But every evening, when Maria parked her car and walked inside still in uniform, she felt the weight of the lesson that night had taught everyone. Assumptions were dangerous. False reports could destroy lives. And sometimes, justice didn't come in the form of punishment. It came in the form of truth revealed in front of everyone. One evening, a week later, John sat beside Maria on the porch as the sun dipped low. He looked across the street at Karen's house, curtains tightly drawn, and shook his head. "You know," he said, "I don't think we'll be hearing much from her anymore." Maria smiled softly. Sometimes silence is the best apology. Sat quietly, enjoying the calm, knowing their neighborhood would never be quite the same again. Karen's reign as the self-appointed watchdog was over, and all it had taken was her trying to call the police on the one person. She should have never crossed the new chief of police herself, and with that irony still lingering in the air, John and Maria leaned back, finally at peace, while across the street, Karen sat alone, swallowed by the consequences of her own choices.